Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are located here in Treaty 1 territory, and the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Niniwak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are gathered here this evening for what is sure to be a fascinating talk and conversation with best-selling author and economist Jeff Rubin, to which you may applaud. He is back in Winnipeg to discuss his latest book, which is A Map of the New Normal: How Inflation, War, and Sanctions Will Change Your World Forever. In its pages, Rubin warns that the shock inflation of 2021 is the front of a perfect storm of war, supply chain disruption, geopolitical realignment, domestic upheaval, and energy scarcity that will change everything. He's been described by Now magazine as a fiercely independent thinker, and this book serves as a testament to the aptness of that statement. Many thanks to Penguin Canada for publishing this book and for helping to make this evening a reality. We're so glad that you could join us both here in person and virtually. If you are here, please note that following the conversation, there will be an opportunity for questions from you. So if you are located here, please just put up your hand and I'll wander over to you with this microphone, which is not a comment on your ability to project your voice. It just ensures that those watching at home can hear the questions. And if you are one of those watching at home, please feel free to write any questions you might have into the chat, and we will put them to the author as time permits. I would also like to apologize to those in attendance for the sun. Please rest assured that its orbit will take it away from your eyes very shortly, and you'll be able to enjoy the evening. So thank you for your indulgence. I'll be back at the close of the event to review signing procedure. The only thing I will put in your brain right now is that at the close of the event, we'll ask you to remain in place for just one moment while we safely transport Jeff Rubin over to a table by our cash desk. And I'll have more details for you at the close of the event. But for now, I have the great pleasure of introducing your host for this evening, who will introduce Jeff Rubin. Temur Durrani is a national reporter for the Globe and Mail, focusing on Manitoba. He is also the host of Better For It, a Globe podcast about how failure shaped Canadian business leaders. Previously, he was a technology reporter for the Globe's Report on Business, based in Toronto. A globe-trotting news hound, Mr. Durrani has covered protests in Hong Kong, graffiti art in India and Pakistan, crashes in Alaska, crime in the GTA, federal politics in Ottawa, small business in the Maritimes, finance on the prairies, and even the Raptors' historic run to the NBA final. Before joining the Globe, he worked at BNN Bloomberg, where he reported investigative stories and business features for broadcast and digital audiences. Prior to that, he was a staff reporter at the Winnipeg Free Press, the Toronto Star, iPolitics, and the New Brunswick Telegraph Journal. He is now stationed in Winnipeg. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Temur Durrani.
I'm going to do a bit of a switcheroo. I'll stand here, introduce Jeff, and then come right back and talk to him in a bit. I'm Temur Durrani. Jeff Rubin is a Canadian economist and best-selling author, a world-leading expert on trade and energy, and former chief economist and chief strategist at CIBC World Markets. He recently served as a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance, founded by Jim Balsillie. His first book, Why Your World is About to Get a Whole Lot Smaller, was an international bestseller and was favorably reviewed in both Time and Newsweek. It was the #1 selling nonfiction book in Canada and won the National Book Award and was longlisted for the Financial Times and Goldman Sachs Business Book of the Year award. Since then, he has written multiple bestsellers, including The End of Growth, The Carbon Bubble, and The Expendables. So we're in for a really great evening with him. Everybody put another round of applause for Jeff Rubin.
Well, first off, let me thank McNally Robinson for once again agreeing to host an event over a book that I've written. I'd like to talk to you today about economic sanctions, or more bluntly, economic warfare. It's something that you've probably come across in the news recently. It's by no means new. The first reported use of economic sanctions was 2,500 years ago during the Peloponnesian War, where Athens imposed sanctions on merchants from the port city of Megara. More recently, of course, the Union blockaded Confederate ports to interdict the cotton trade, which was the lifeblood of the Confederate economy and led to their demise. But it really wasn't until World War I that the full force and horror of sanctions, or as it was called at the time, the starvation weapon, became apparent. The National Health Office in Berlin in 1918 estimated that over 750,000 Germans starved to death as a direct result of Allied sanctions. Another 300,000 perished in the Ottoman Empire as its ports were also blockaded. The horror of that led to a peace movement that agitated for the barring of sanctions, much like movements today would agitate for the barring of the use of nuclear weapons, because back in those days, sanctions were the nuclear weapon. And indeed, the use of sanctions fell markedly after the first two great world wars. By 1960, there were only 4 countries in the world that were subject to either US or UN sanctions, accounting for an insignificant sliver of global trade and global GDP. Since then, however, sanctions have made a spectacular recovery. Today, there are no less than 54 countries that are subject to some form of sanctions. They account for 1/3 of global GDP. And at the rate at which sanctions are being applied virtually every week, last week, announcements of huge tariffs against China by the Biden administration, we'll very quickly come to the point where over half of global GDP is subject to some kind of trade impairment. The United States has been far and away the most active country in imposing sanctions. Sanctions have grown spectacularly from around 500 a year under the Biden administration to around 900 a year under the Trump administration to around 1,100 a year under the Biden administration. And as that spectacular rise will indicate, it really hasn't mattered whether there was a Democratic or Republican administration in the White House. Sanctions have risen spectacularly. They are no longer the exception, they are the new normal. And we would do well to consider its consequences. In fact, we would do well to consider where this ever escalating economic warfare will lead to. Can the US and its allies continue to expect to use their overwhelming military and economic power to dictate security terms to the rest of the world? And if the US cannot do that, what are the consequences of losing the sanction war? Well, you see, over the last 2 decades, I guess recently, the US is being challenged in a way that it's never been challenged. Since World War I, well, at least since World War II, the US has been the global hegemon. It's been the one dominant power. But now it's being challenged, as I say, in a way unprecedented. because a growing number of economic heavyweights in the developing world are aligning themselves with America's traditional enemies, Russia and China, in a rapidly expanding BRICS. I mean, if we look at who's joining these countries, these are the largest growing economies in the world. For example, over the last 20 years, China, Russia, India, and Brazil have been the 4 fastest growing economies. The 5th is recently BRICS joined Saudi Arabia. By contrast, the United States is 12th. There's a lineup around the block of countries wanting to join BRICS, including even Mexico, that wants to hedge its free trade deal with Canada and the United States. If BRICS accepts all of these countries, its GDP will exceed that of the G7. It will account for over half of the world's population. It will possess half of the world's oil reserves, 2/3 of the world's natural gas reserves. In short, it will be a force to reckon with. As BRIC membership grows, the reach and effectiveness of Western sanctions shrink. And what about sanctions? You know, now into its 3rd year, what have sanctions actually achieved? The sanctions imposed on Russia were claimed by the Biden administration to be the severest of any sanctions imposed against any country in the entire post-war period. But contrary to widespread predictions that these sanctions would bring the Russian economy and the Russian war machine to its knees, the Russian economy did not collapse. The small decline in GDP was not out of line with the recessions that we saw in sanctioning countries themselves, Germany, the United Kingdom, indeed the entire European Union, which as a result of soaring energy prices went into a recession of which it has only recently emerged. And it certainly hasn't stopped the Russian war effort now into its 3rd year. If anything, it's been the catalyst for the Russian economy to become a war economy. So why has Russia been able to withstand these sanctions that we were told it would not be able to tolerate? Well, for one, they weren't exactly a surprise. I mean, Putin has been busily sanction-proofing the Russian economy since 2014, when sanctions were first imposed after Russia's annexation of Crimea. But perhaps a more significant factor is that unlike in the past, and believe me, Russia's been sanctioned since the Bolshevik government first took power in 1917. Unlike in the past, Russia does not stand alone. It has powerful allies who have welcomed with open arms sanctioned Russian goods into their vast markets. And I speak here of fellow BRICS members, China and India. In the past, the loss of European energy markets would have brought the Russian economy, and by implication, the Russian war machine, to its knees. But instead, today, in the face of those sanctions, last year, Russian energy export earnings set an all-time record high. Well, what's changed is not only where Russia sells its energy, but in what currency Russia sells its energy. And the victim here is not the Russian ruble. The victim here is the 50-year reign of the petrodollar that sanctions have brought to an end. You see, since 1974, Saudi Arabia has only sold its oil in dollars. And then it has in turn reinvested those dollars into the US Treasuries market, which is the US government bond market. And Saudi Arabia used its leadership position in OPEC to get the rest of the cartel's members to follow suit. You can thank the United States and its Western allies' efforts to sabotage the ruble to bring that regime to an end. Because what it forced Russia to do, and something that Russia should have done long ago, was to no longer accept dollars, and up until the sanctions, 95% of the revenue from Russian oil and gas, and by the way, Russia is the world's largest energy exporter, was in dollars. Not anymore. You want to buy Russian oil? You want to buy Russian natural gas? You pay in rubles. And that is a huge change. And it's had a domino effect because shortly after, Saudi Arabia has agreed that its largest customer, China, no longer pays in dollars, but pays in yuan. When the world's largest energy exporting country, Russia, and the world's largest energy importing country, China, both have sued the dollar, then I think it's fair to say that the era of the petrodollar has come to an end. But the dollar risks far more than losing its status as a petrodollar. The dollar risks losing its status as the reserve currency of the world, which it has enjoyed since the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1946. You see, what the Biden administration, in its enthusiasm to cripple the ruble, didn't realize is that when it confiscated $300 billion of dollar reserves of the Central Bank of Russia, it was undermining one of the key pillars that supported the dollar's status as the reserve currency of the world. Instead of providing an insurance policy against financial risk, as US dollar holdings had done for decades for foreign central banks, it had become a ticking time bomb. Because at any moment in time, a decision could be made in Washington to confiscate those dollar reserves. And there was no way that a central bank could hedge that risk short of reducing the amount of dollars it held in its foreign reserves. And that is exactly what the People's Bank of China and indeed central banks of BRICS countries are doing. And as they continue to do that, it's only a matter of time before the dollar will have to share its crown with contenders. Sanctions haven't been any more successful against their other target, China. And when it comes to China, the primary goal of sanctions is to deny the Chinese economy and the Chinese military, by implication, leading state-of-the-art semiconductor chip technology. But can sanctions really do that? Because what the Biden administration is trying to do is reverse the force of economic gravity, and that's a tall order. You see, despite Washington's efforts to halt the diffusion of semiconductor technology, really can't be done because the largest chip market in the world, which is China, is inexorably going to attract the leading chip technology. And if you doubt that, just recently, Huawei profiled their new Mate 60 phone with 5G technology that China wasn't supposed to have. No company has more at stake in a full-fledged Sino-American all-out economic war, then the world's most valuable company, Apple, with its $3 trillion market capitalization. 95% of Apple's iPhones and Apple's Mac computers are manufactured in China. What happens if all of a sudden Apple can't access its plants in China? Can you afford to buy an Apple product if instead of being manufactured by its principal supplier, Foxconn in China, ironically a Taiwanese company, paying $1.50 an hour, it's manufactured in Cupertino, California, where Apple is headquartered, paying a minimum wage of $15.50. What's true of Apple is true of a host of American companies. While sanctions have failed to shred or buckle the Chinese or Russian economy, what sanctions have done is shredded the very global trading system that we've been told is the basis of our collective prosperity for the last 40 years. Instead of fostering the highly specialized economies, which globalization did, globalization said, you should do what you're best at, do what your comparative advantage is. In a world of sanctions, the economy must become a jack of all trades, because now we are meeting our domestic needs, not from some far-flung supply chains, but we're meeting them from either producing it ourselves or from our friends. From an economist's perspective, today's worlds of sanctions is a lot less efficient than the world that it is replacing. If David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage holds that international trade makes us all better off, then sanctions make us all worse off, and that includes you. Economic warfare promises to finish the job that the economic lockdowns from the pandemic started. I mean, when the lockdowns from the pandemic started, we first got our initial doubts about globalization, because just-in-time inventory became just too late. And we weren't talking about lawn chairs or tennis shoes. We were talking about respirators. We were talking about masks. We were talking about vaccines and the greatest public health crisis since the Spanish flu of 1918. In the new normal defined by growing economic conflict and ever-escalating economic tensions, suddenly it's no longer about cost. Suddenly it's about the security of supply. And that's why friendshoring has replaced offshoring. The only problem with friendshoring is that all of America's friends, like us, Australia, Western Europe, Japan, are high-wage economies, just like America. So it may make sense from a security of supply standpoint. It doesn't make any economic sense, because anything that we're going to make here that we used to get in China is going to cost 2 to 3 times as much. Now, that's obviously not a good news story for inflation, but in one way it is a good news story. It's a good news story because we're going to see the return of manufacturing jobs that we thought were gone forever. We're going to see the return of middle-class jobs from the middle class that has been decimated by decades of offshoring. So that's the essential trade-off that we're making, whether our governments are cognizant of it or not. But of course, the consequence of that is inflation. And inflation is not a passing blip. It's part of the new normal. Like a cancer, that starts off as a local tumor, but metastasizes and spreads throughout the body. So too has inflation metastasized. It started off in food and energy prices, which is the direct result of sanctions. Because when you sanction the world's largest grain and energy exporter, there are consequences for the prices of alternative supply. And it is that growth into wages. I mean, wages are now running at 6% in the US economy that poses the greatest challenge for inflation. Because wages just don't affect the price of food and energy. Wages affect the price of everything. In the midst of so much change and uncertainty, we can no longer count on what we took for granted for decades. Most of all, a world trading system that we've been continually told makes us all better off. But while we can't get a full view of the emerging new normal, with every passing day, we get a better glimpse of what the contours of this new world looks like. And I think as we sail further and further along this course of inevitable global conflict, one thing has already become clear. There's no going back to the world we once knew. It simply no longer exists. Thank you. You don't have to stand. I'm sitting down. I think I'm good.
Perfect, fantastic. That was such a great address, sort of talking about all the different points that I want to ask you about. So we're going to go a little specific with them. I'm going to start with some questions about the form of writing as well, you know, and then I want to also talk about the content of the book itself without giving it as many spoilers as possible. It's not exactly one of those books, like some of the things you've talked about. So we're going to hold on to some of those things that people will enjoy in the book itself. But I want to start off by asking you some questions that I know everybody's always curious about when we read books like this, which is the way in which it landed the way it does in front of us right now, right? I imagine when you were starting, it was a very different book when you were studying these things and you were wanting to put them down. How did that come about, this new normal that you're mapping in this book?
Well, this book took a very circuitous route. When I was first approached by Penguin Random House, who's my publisher, I was asked to write a book about what the economy would look like coming out of the pandemic. So it was really the economic legacy of the pandemic. And the first couple of chapters of the book were actually from that original, like the Big Easy, was originally from that project. But about, I don't know, 4 or 5 months into writing it, Russia invaded Ukraine and the West responded with these massive sanctions. And it quickly became apparent to both myself and my publisher that there was a bigger story at play. So we switched gears. And that's why it took me over 2 years to write this book, which is about double the time that it normally takes for me anyway, to write a book. So that sort of, unlike my other 4 books, where, you know, it was a straight line, like, here's what we want you to do, and here's what I did. I did, okay? This took a huge U-turn. Not that the pandemic wasn't important. It was the first real challenge to globalization, and some things have remained, like, for example, where I used to work in the bank towers down on Bay Street because I was chief economist of an investment bank. You go there on a Monday or Friday, and there's no one there.
Yeah.
And every third store has like a for lease sign.
Yeah.
And so working at home has become part of the new normal and has outlived any public health rationale that originally supported it. So it's not like the pandemic hasn't left an imprint, But in my opinion, at least, it's that imprint is dwarfed by the impact that global economic warfare is having on our economy.
I want to, one of the things that you've done with this book is that you've broken down these concepts that we're all familiar with from the news and things we're seeing, and we're trying to understand them from an economic perspective. And one of the things you've done, and I want to sort of go right at the top of the book, which is not a spoiler again, but it's such a great introduction to people to understand what change really can mean, like from an economic perspective. It's this story of an Icelandic boy, right, who in your introduction you talk about was one of the few people who suffered when the country moved directions in the way that cars drive there, right? And it's a particularly poignant tale in which it then reflects all the different things you're talking about, which are the global changing forces that we all are still getting used to. Tell me about that a little bit.
Well,
why is that important?
I mean, I guess what I was trying to achieve was our greatest danger is complacency. I mean, that little boy, that truck came out of nowhere because, why should it be driving down that lane? And we get used to a certain way of thinking. And then suddenly when changes happen, it's hard for us to adjust, particularly when we see things through the fog of war. And make no mistake about it, we're at war. Okay, I mean, America's fighting a proxy war with Russia, but the economic war brings it home to you. You go to the grocery store, you fill up your tank, you look at what your mortgage rate is. That's the economic war coming home to you. And, through the media, we tend to think of that propaganda is this exclusive domain of authoritarian countries. Well, guess what? Propaganda
works everywhere.
is a lot wider than that.
Yeah.
And in a time of war, the main focus of propaganda is to galvanize public support for the war. So the war is cast as a biblical struggle between good and evil. And the leaders of our opponents are satanic, okay? And this is all about a biblical good versus evil, where in fact, this is really Game of Thrones. Okay, this is, massive geopolitical plates colliding against each other, and they both have a common objective, world power, okay? And each one has its ideology. If we believe our propaganda, America spends more on defense than the entire GDP of Africa to defend global democracy. In Russia, it's I'm protecting Slavic people. In China, it's the Middle Kingdom should once again regain its center like it was back in the 17th century. But what drives all of these ideologies is the same dynamic. And the dynamic is world power. And whereas for the first, 50 years of the post-war period, there was one world power, and it's called the US economy, the US. Now it's being challenged. And you see these, dark and foreboding pictures of stern-looking Chinese troops, the buildup of the Chinese military. Here's a little fact check that doesn't get mentioned in the fog of war. The Chinese economy is almost as large as the US economy, but their defense spending is 25% of the US. Which country do you think has more headroom to build up defense spending?
Right. One of the things I think you also do there in that is, especially when you're bringing up these concepts that have been part of Western conventional wisdom and what people have been told for a while, is you, in demystifying them, you separate yourself in the voice, right? You kind of present both sides, but you also sort of explain it in that
I
way.
provide a bit of historical context, okay? It's not just Putin's war, okay? Putin's not the only dude out of 144 million people in Russia who take exception to the fact that NATO doubled in size after giving Gorbachev an assurance that they would not expand a square inch. And with the exception of Belarus and Ukraine, all of Russia's European borders has NATO missiles. And President Xi is not the only person out of 104 billion Chinese who think that Taiwan is part of China, because guess what? Up until since the 17th century, it has been. And guess what? It will be again. So that's, but we tend, in the media, it's democracy versus tyranny, good versus evil. And I just think it's important that readers get a bit of a historical perspective on why Russia and China might be taking the actions that they're doing, and how they're not singularly dependent on who those leaders are, because other leaders in Russia and China would follow very similar policies.
I want to ask you about that a little bit more. Why do you think it was important to frame it in that way of sort of making sure people understand that there isn't this propaganda that we're used to in Western media that you say, in particular from a sanctions perspective, because that's been so much part of our way of, okay, these sanctions are actually working in these countries, and that's what the media proposes, right?
The media will tell you two things. And if I had to admit, the Globe and Mail, even though they published a nice op-ed, the Globe and Mail is part of that media, as is CBC. The media would have you believe two things. One, this is good versus evil, okay? This is, no shades of gray. It's Russia, evil Russia, China versus good West. Second, sanctions are crippling our enemies. Well, sanctions are crippling ourselves. And if you want to believe that it's good versus evil, okay, but it is what it is. And the fact is, sanctions aren't going away. Sanctions are part of the new normal, and it totally contradicts everything that we've been told for the last 4 decades is the basis of our collective prosperity, which is, the neoliberal order of the free flow of goods, capital, and technology.
I always take it, it's always interesting when people say the media with a capital T, capital M, that I take issue with, only because that's not how I always did it. But I take your point. I think in general, Western media, and the Globe of course included, when we frame wars, when it's looked at from a broader perspective and not just individual sort of stories, individual columns, things like that, you look at it from a perspective and you really do take away that this is the way it is. There's a bad person here and there's a good person here, but that grayness of it all that we really know to be true sometimes does not get across to people in that way. And that's something your book really does point out, especially from an economic perspective.
Again, that's why I dedicated the book to a clearer understanding of what's really going on, because you'll find that most of the content of my book you won't find in conventional media. And that's not because I'm so brilliant. It's just because they don't like what I have to say.
Speaking of which, one of those things is the interest rates, your argument on that. I want to ask you about that because, again, there's been a lot of conjecture right now about how inflation is under control, our interest rates are going to fall, this is going to bring relief to the housing market. There's a lot of that. Many people aren't believing it.
I don't believe it for 1 second.
So tell me about that, actually. Okay. Where do you come at it from that? Well, especially in Canada, that kind of a perspective.
Yeah. The mortgage market is a very dangerous place for both borrower and for lender. Let me talk first for lender, because I used to be chief economist of a bank. My alma mater, CIBC, along with TD and BMO, 20% of their residential mortgage book, which is $130 billion of loans, are in negative amortization. Negative amortization. When you hear these fancy terms, the one common denominator about these fancy terms is they hide scary facts. What does negative amortization actually mean? It means that your monthly payment, forget about paying off principal, your monthly payment doesn't even cover all of your interest costs. So the uncovered interest gets capitalized. By that I mean it gets added to the size of your mortgage. So instead of paying your mortgage off over time, as is the standard practice, with negative amortization, your mortgage actually gets bigger over time. And when housing prices fall, as they have, then all of a sudden homeowners don't have much equity. And when homeowners don't have much equity, as we found out in 2007, 2008 subprime mortgage crisis, then instead of mailing in a check, they mail in the keys. Now, let me tell you why this is going to get worse. Because mortgage rates aren't going to fall. They're going to rise. And they're going to rise very significantly. And let me tell you why. Mortgage rates are priced off the Government of Canada bond curve, or in the US, the Treasuries curve. So the very popular 5-year fixed rate mortgage is priced off the 5-year Government of Canada bond. Normally, the slope of the yield curve, or the term structure of interest rates, is such that the longer the duration of the bond, the higher the interest rate. So normally, a 5-year Government of Canada bond would be about 100 basis points, that's 1 percentage point, above whatever the Bank of Canada's target rate is that you hear about, at their rate setting meetings. Today, we have what is called a yield curve inversion. Now, I know this isn't a fixed income audience, but let me just say in broad brush terms what that means. It means that bond yields are not above the overnight rate, they're under it, and they're under it substantially. The 5 years, as much as 100, 150 basis points below. That usually occurs when we're on the eve of a recession, because then the bond market is pricing in multiple central bank rate cuts to resuscitate the economy. There's no recession in sight. I mean, there was in Euroland, but not in North America. So why is the bond market expecting Bank of Canada rate cuts? And believe me, it is expecting. At the beginning of this year, the bond market was expecting that the Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve Board would cut interest rates no less than 6 times. That's been pared back to 3 times. By the summer, it'll be 0 times. And when it's 0 times, the curve won't be inverted, because the rationale for the inversion is all of these pending rate cuts. If the curve goes back to its normal slope, you're talking about a 200 basis point rise in the 5-year Canada bond. What do you think that means for the 5-year fixed rate mortgage? It's right now about, 5.5, 5 3/4. Make that 7.5, 7 3/4. And you know what? We now have a stress test. So for CIBC to write that mortgage for you, you have to demonstrate that you could afford to pay that plus 2 percentage points. That'll be like a 9.5%. Mortgage rates are like a gatekeeper. They control who gets to participate in the housing market and who doesn't. And as mortgage rates are ratcheted up, less people go through those turnstiles. And the less people bidding on a house, the lower that house comes to you. So that's how the war in Ukraine comes home to you.
Yeah, because you frame that in the global perspective that is often missing when we look at inflation in Canada and these, rates when we're talking about interest rates and that kind of a thing. Why do you think that is important? And those are going to be some of the last questions. Please hold on to your questions because after I'm done, I would love for you guys to ask.
Okay, well, the Globe and Mail, just to use the Globe, or, the Guardian, or the New York Times doesn't want you to connect those dots. And I think the reason is obvious why they don't want you to connect those dots. Because if you did connect those dots, you may question the proxy war that the United States is fighting in Ukraine, and who knows in Taiwan, and who knows in the Middle East. But my point is, economic warfare comes home to you. Okay, and nowhere is that more important than in inflation. And what happens with inflation governs what happens with interest rates. And what happens with interest rates determines whether you are going to rent or you are going to own a home.
Right, and you're right. I think a lot of the things that when we see them covered in the media, they're particularly looked at as separate events that aren't always.
They're not
connected.
they're
not
connected.
Yeah,
it's just a coincidence that inflation soared to levels that we hadn't seen since the OPEC oil shocks, and this coincidentally happened at the same time that we imposed sanctions.
Perspective, right? Like we like looking at this as business and this is politics and this is that, but they're not all connected in the same way. And your book does a fantastic job of sort of connecting those dots in that
way. That's what I was trying to do. I hope I've been successful.
I think those are some of the questions. I do have more, of course, but I'm going to open the floor at this point, I think, for any questions. We have John. John, would you be able to help us out with that? Okay, so I think we'll go right over there first. Yeah, maybe, that's over there. Yeah, maybe let's start there.
Thank you for that very illuminating, enthusiastic talk. And I'm trying to read between the lines a little bit about what you said and what I've noticed in your book, and that is, if you were wearing your CIBC World Markets hat at the
I haven't worn that for a long, long time, but I still remember a few things in my former life.
The question that I'm wrestling with is, how do you survive the new normal and profit from it? And it sounds to me, I'll just give you some thoughts off the top of my head, you'd favor brick economies and investments in brick companies, you'd favor raw materials, water, energy, and all the things that are going to be pricier in the new normal. Am I correct on that?
Yes, if you're going to be allowed to invest in those economies. Like I told Nick, my publisher, hey Nick, we got to sell this book in Russia. And he's going, Jeff, Russia sanctioned. Penguin Random House can't sell the book in Russia, okay? So yes, you're absolutely right. What are the fastest growing economies? They're going to be BRICS economies. But what are, right now it's getting to the point where you can't invest in China anymore. In 5 years from now, you may not be able to invest in India. So as economic warfare ratchets it up, it's not just trade, it's also investment, okay? Like we don't want Chinese companies investing in rare earth element mines, okay? We don't want American companies investing in China's chip technology. So you're right, BRICS is the place to invest. Whether you'll be able to invest is a second question. How can we benefit? There is a quid pro quo and there is a silver lining. And I talked about, friendshoring means we're gonna make stuff. Okay, like for the last 30, 40 years, we've been living off the avails of consuming cheap overseas labor. And we're not gonna be able to do that anymore. So we're gonna make toasters, we're gonna make cars, we're gonna make jeans. And that creates not just jobs, it creates earnings and cash flow. So I think the firms that are going to be growing, it's not Apple, okay? I mean, if right now, the trade restrictions that the US has with Russia were to apply with China, Apple would go bankrupt. So it's not Apple, it's the firms that are now going to be friendshoring, okay? That are going to be producing stuff either here or in the United States or in Australia or Western Europe. That's what the sanctions world wants to happen, okay? And I'm arguing, you know, from an economist standpoint, from an economic efficiency standpoint, that that's suboptimal. But going forward, that's where the growth areas will be in our economy, because that's what's being mandated by our government.
Two things from that before we go to the next question. I do want to ask again, you talk about friendshoring and versus offshoring quite a bit in your book. Tell us quickly a little bit about that, just so that people know what you mean by friendshoring.
Okay,
so
this
is a very great, like it's a fun concept that you kind of almost coined in some ways. Tell me a little bit about that.
Oh, I didn't coin it. Janet Yellen,
Yes,
former chair of the Federal Reserve Board and now U.S. Treasury Secretary. I don't know if she invented the word, but she was the first person to publicize it. So friendshoring means trade with your friends. And the idea is here, in a world of economic warfare, security of supply. And we saw with COVID that even when there wasn't economic warfare, there were problems with far-flung supply. So this builds on that. So friendshoring is just, or decoupling, and that's sort of the other synonym for it, is don't trade with China. Now, here's the problem. You know, sanctioning Russia is very important in energy and in food, but Russia is the 30th largest trading partner of the US in bilateral trade. China is the largest. So when you try to decouple from your largest trading partner, there are consequences.
So there's that. The other thing too, that actually I also wanted to say, you rightfully pointed it out in your question, the hat from the CIBC perspective, which you haven't worn in a while. So I'm going to press you a little bit more on that, because it is true. You do sense that in the book a little bit, you know, that you're trying to sort of not speak from it, but you are allowing people to read between the lines there from that perspective as well.
Well, I do have 20 years experience as the chief economist of an investment.
So I guess my only thing before we move on to the next thing is, how important do you think it is when you were listening and when we're reading your book and that kind of a thing, to also take it that this is the kind of hidden truth that maybe CIBC might not want to say and that you're now saying out loud? Are we to take that from it in that way?
Well, I'm no longer a managing director of the bank, but I'm sure the mortgage book has their full attention. Because as I say, when people don't have any equities in their home, it's really easy to walk away from your mortgage. And yeah, sure, CIBC or TD or BMO can confiscate your home, but that's not really what they want to do in selling you mortgages. They don't want to repossess your home. They just want you to send them a mortgage check. And I'm saying that this problem is going to get significantly worse because interest rates are going up. And by that, I don't mean that the Bank of Canada is going to be raising its overnight target rate. I just mean they ain't cutting. And if they don't cut, you could see as much as a 2% rise in bond yields, because a yield curve inversion is not, to use a popular term these days, sustainable.
Okay, we'll go to another question, John. Thank you. Maybe we'll go at the back right there with that gentleman up there. And then we'll move right over here if you guys have questions on this side.
Sir, concerning the first part of your book, would you speak on quantitative easing, that whole technique that I found so fascinating?
Well, quantitative easing, remember I told you fancy terms disguise ugly facts? Quantitative easing is code word for let's print money, okay? Now, see, what happened in the pandemic? All of a sudden, deficits exploded, like in Canada. And this was not uniquely Canadian, but in Canada, the deficit went from around 30 billion to over 300 billion. Normally, like in my 20 years, and after every federal budget, okay, I was sent around the world, you know, Kuwait Investment Fund, the Vatican, the Landis banks, to convince people what a great fiscal job Canada's doing so they buy the bonds, because that's what chief economist of an investment bank does. Okay, in my days, there was a natural check on government deficits. And it was because the bigger the deficit, the bigger the borrowing program. The bigger the borrowing program, the higher the cost of borrowing. Okay, the higher the cost of borrowing, the more tax revenue goes to bondholders instead of getting program spending, and that's not without its electoral repercussions. So there was a natural check. So you might go, well, if the deficit went from 30 billion to 300 billion, unheard of, okay? I guess, you know, government bond yields skyrocketed. No, they plummeted. They plummeted to all-time lows. A 10-year government of Canada bond was 0.5%. Now, again, I know this isn't a fixed income audience, but I'll just point out one thing. The price of a bond and the yield are inversely related. So when you have record low yields, you have record high prices way above par. So the question then becomes, why would an insurance company or a pension plan or a retail investor buy bonds at record high prices to get record low yields to finance unheard of size deficits? Well, the answer is really simple. They weren't the ones buying the bonds. Who was buying the bonds? The Bank of Canada, to the tune of $3 billion a week. By the end of the pandemic, they owned almost half of all of the government of Canada bonds. You see, the Bank of Canada, see, a pension plan, insurance company, retail investor, they care about performance.
Yeah.
The central bank didn't think it cared about performance. We'll see if that's ultimately true, okay? And Chrystia Freeland had the audacity, after running up that $300 billion deficit, to say that debt servicing costs as a percentage of tax revenue was near an all-time low. What she failed to mention was that's because she ordered Tiff Macklem to buy all the bonds at egregiously high prices. So what does that all leave? The late American economist, Milton Friedman, he probably never would get mentioned on CBC, I'm just guessing here, the father of the monetary school, his famous dictum was that inflation at all times and everywhere is a monetary phenomenon. And that never rung truer. It built up a powder keg that was just waiting to be sparked. And the biggest sanctions on the world's largest energy and grain exporter blew that powder keg sky high. And then we had the 6, 7, 8% inflation rates. So that's what quantitative easing is all about. Why were they able to do it? Well, they are able to do it because inflation was well behaved at the time. Nobody was going to complain about how low bond yields were when it meant that a 5-year fixed term mortgage was below 2%. And those huge fiscal deficits was, after all, the result of me getting very generous gold. So, you know, what's wrong with this picture? Well, what's wrong with this picture was you can do it when inflation's 1 or 2%, but you can't do it when inflation's 5 to 6%, because then everybody sees the emperor is wearing no clothes.
And this framing of the central banks as well is very evident in the book in so many different
Right, and this
ways,
is
right?
not
Yeah,
uniquely
yeah.
Bank of
Yeah.
Canada, but we're here in Canada, so let's
Totally,
talk
yeah.
about the Bank of Canada.
Totally. Even you talk about it in the way with the Russian central bank in that way, and the way that we're talking about it from that perspective too. Yeah. Other questions in the audience? Maybe we'll take a few more. We're almost at the end of, I think we're actually technically at the end of our time,
We
right?
have time for one more.
Let's
before
do
closing
one more, maybe
comments.
on this side if there's, okay, we'll go with this gentleman right at the top.
All right.
Sorry. Yeah. But please feel free to ask your questions to Jeff when you're getting your book signed. I'm sure he'd want to answer them then if he can.
Jeff, with the good versus evil theory, wouldn't North America rely more heavily on Mexico as an inexpensive provider of labor? Your thoughts on that?
Okay, it's interesting that Mexico is one of those countries lining up around the block to join BRICS. But let's talk about Mexico. Mexico has a fraction of the size of the labor force that China has. India would be a more logical, but India is in the wrong thing. And Mexico, security costs are the reason that companies don't go to Mexico, because Mexico is basically laws. So that's a major issue. Like all of those auto plants have their own security forces there, because you cannot rely on the state police in Mexico to provide security. So that's why Mexico is not an option. But again, I point out, if Mexico was so satisfied with the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, why does it want to join BRICS?
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
So I'll now turn it over to both of you if you have any closing comments you might like to offer.
Yeah, I'll be around for anybody who wants to ask me a question.
This was a fascinating.
As long as my driver Rory sticks around for a while.
This was a fascinating chat, Jeff. Thank you so much.
Thank you for a great interview.
Of course, and I know all of you have a lot of questions, so please do ask them to Jeff if you want. He'll be around signing your books and answering them. Thank you everybody for being here. Great audience with great questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, thank you once again for all your questions and for your attention. Huge thanks to Penguin Canada and of course to Temur Durrani for coming on board to host this event. So a round of applause for Temur.
Yeah, thank you.
We will be moving on to the signing part of the evening, so we'll just beg your indulgence for one moment while we safely escort Jeff Rubin to the signing table beside the cash desk. I'll let you know as soon as you can descend. When we do get there, just one quick note that I'll be wandering down the line to write your name on a Post-it note. It's not because we don't trust you to spell your name, but it means you can spend more time chatting rather than spelling when you get to the table. Thank you all so very much for joining us here this evening, and please do have a wonderful night.